The smell hit Dinah Blackwell before her eyes adjusted to the darkness of the root cellar. Not the usual earthen dampness or the sharp tang of preserved vegetables, but something sweeter, almost floral, coming from the corner where hemlock grew in careful bundles. She stood motionless in the doorway, her hands still carrying the morning's picked rosemary, listening to the silence above where the big house was just beginning to stir. 3 days had passed since they made her watch. 3 days since Overseer Frank Grissom dragged her boy Thomas into the yard and beat him with a hickory cane while Colonel Wesley Hartwell sat on the veranda with his morning coffee, observing the lesson being administered to a slave who'd been caught with pages from a spelling primer hidden in the stable hay. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas had been 14 years old, tall for his age, with his father's broad shoulders and his grandmother's quick mind. He'd wanted to read the way other boys wanted to learn carpentry or blacksmithing, seeing it not as rebellion but as doorway to understanding the world beyond Talbot County's pine forests and cotton fields. Dinah had warned him. Told him the risk wasn't worth it. That knowledge couldn't protect you when protection required the humanity others refused to acknowledge. But Thomas had smiled that particular smile that meant he'd already made his decision, already calculated that some things were worth the danger, and asked her if she'd really want him to live his whole life unable to read his own name. Now his name was carved into a wooden marker in Magnolia Grove Cemetery, set apart from the white section by a split rail fence and 40 years of accumulated certainty about which souls deserved elaborate monuments and which merited only bare earth and memory. They'd left his body in the yard for 3 days as warning, as demonstration, as proof that literacy among the enslaved was not education but insurrection. Dinah had prepared his body for burial when they finally allowed it, washing blood from skin that would never warm again, closing eyes that would never see the words he'd died learning to decipher. Her hands had been steady during the washing. They'd been steady through the burial, through the days of returning to the kitchen house where she managed every meal that crossed Colonel Hartwell's table. But now, standing in the root cellar with hemlock perfuming the air and a hunting party scheduled for Saturday, her hands had stopped shaking not from calm but from the absolute stillness that comes when grief transforms into something with edges and purpose. Colonel Hartwell was hosting 7 guests for his autumn hunting expedition. The invitations had gone out weeks ago, before Thomas died, summoning the men who formed Talbot County's power structure for 3 days of deer hunting in the pine forests north of the plantation. Judge Marcus Pendleton would attend, the man who'd ruled from the bench that slaves had no legal standing to testify against whites. Reverend Silas Carmichael was coming, who preached every Sunday that slavery was ordained by Scripture and that teaching slaves to read was interfering with divine order. Dr. Edmund Vance had confirmed, the physician who'd examined Thomas's body and written death by natural causes following disciplinary correction on paperwork nobody would ever question. The others would be there too. Captain James Fairmont, who commanded the militia that enforced slave patrols. Garrett Sutton, who owned the plantation bordering Hartwell's and had personally returned 3 escaped slaves for reward money and the satisfaction of watching them whipped. Luther Wickham, the auctioneer who'd separated more families than he could count, treating human beings like livestock with less ceremony than a horse trader. Bradford Colfax, the tax assessor who'd recently proposed legislation to make teaching slaves to read a capital offense rather than merely illegal. 7 men who would gather at Hartwell's hunting lodge 8 miles north, where Dinah would prepare their meals in the lodge's kitchen, serving them the way she'd served such men for 18 years. The way her mother had served their fathers before Colonel Hartwell purchased Dinah at auction when she was 14, same age Thomas had been when they killed him. The kitchen work had seemed like fortune at the time, better than field labor, offering skills that made her valuable enough to avoid the worst punishments, positioned close enough to power to overhear the conversations that revealed how that power operated. But proximity to power also meant proximity to its architects, and Dinah had spent nearly 2 decades watching these men and others like them discuss slave management with the same analytical detachment they applied to crop rotation or livestock breeding. She'd heard Judge Pendleton explain over brandy why the law couldn't recognize slave testimony because doing so would destabilize the entire labor system. She'd listened to Reverend Carmichael cite scripture between courses, building theological justification for separating children from mothers when financial necessity required it. She'd served Dr. Vance while he discussed with clinical precision which punishments produced compliance without reducing work capacity. The hunting party was tradition, annual ritual where these men left their wives and town responsibilities to spend 3 days in masculine fellowship, shooting deer and drinking whiskey and reassuring each other that the increasing tensions over slavery in Kansas and Congress were nothing but northern fanaticism that would collapse under its own impracticality. Dinah had cooked for 5 of these gatherings, preparing venison stew and roasted duck and apple preserves while the men congratulated themselves on another successful year maintaining order in Talbot County. This year she would cook for them again. But this year she would be using everything her mother's mother had taught her about herbs and roots and the thin line between healing and harm. Esther, the elderly woman who'd taken Dinah under her care when she first arrived at Hartwell Plantation, had been born in Virginia to a mother who'd learned plant medicine in Africa before the Middle Passage. Esther knew which leaves reduced fever and which induced it, which roots settled stomach pain and which created agony that looked like natural illness, which mushrooms were nutritious and which caused the kind of death that physicians like Dr. Vance would attribute to spoiled meat or bad water. Dinah had learned it all. Originally to heal, to help when other enslaved people fell sick and Dr. Vance was too busy or too indifferent to attend to slave quarters. But knowledge was neutral, and application determined whether healing wisdom became something else entirely. The same foxglove that regulated heartbeat in small doses caused cardiac arrest in larger ones. The same jimsonweed that reduced inflammation in tincture form created hallucinations and respiratory failure when concentrated. The same death cap mushrooms that looked similar to edible varieties caused liver destruction that took days to kill, long enough for their source to be forgotten. The kitchen house sat 50 yards from the main residence, constructed separately so cooking fires wouldn't threaten the primary structure. It was Dinah's domain, the space where she commanded 4 other enslaved women in producing meals that maintained Colonel Hartwell's reputation for hospitality. The kitchen contained a massive brick hearth, iron pots of various sizes, a work table scarred from decades of chopping, shelves lined with preserved goods, and the particular accumulated knowledge of 18 years learning exactly how the colonel and his guests preferred their food prepared. Dinah knew that Judge Pendleton ate venison only if cooked until tender enough to cut with a fork, his teeth having gone bad from years of sweet consumption. She knew Reverend Carmichael avoided pork but consumed duck with enthusiasm, always requesting seconds. She knew Dr. Vance drank his coffee black and strong, complaining if it was served any other way. She knew Captain Fairmont had developed a fondness for the wild mushroom stew Dinah prepared. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Using varieties she gathered from the forest, praising her skill at identifying the safe species. That knowledge, accumulated through years of invisible service, became tactical information when grief turned to mathematics. 7 guests plus Colonel Hartwell made 8 men. 3 days at the hunting lodge, beginning Friday evening and concluding Monday morning. Multiple meals requiring preparation in the lodge kitchen where Dinah would work with minimal supervision, the men being occupied with hunting during daylight hours. Opportunities for introducing substances into food that would affect some or all of them depending on careful calculation of portions and timing. But rushing would be mistake. Dinah had watched enough of these men operate to understand that power protected itself through assumption of order, and anything that looked like organized resistance would be investigated with resources she couldn't match. Random tragedy was ignorable. Pattern was threat. If all 8 men died during the same meal from obvious poisoning, questions would multiply until answers emerged that led back to the kitchen, to Dinah, to execution that wouldn't be as quick as what they'd given Thomas. The approach required patience, precision, and the appearance of naturalness. Men died in hunting accidents regularly. Men consumed bad water or spoiled food and suffered illness that sometimes proved fatal. Men made errors in the woods that resulted in injuries their bodies couldn't survive. Each death needed plausible explanation unconnected to the others, spread across enough time and space that no pattern emerged to trigger investigation. Dinah had 3 days to reduce that number from 8 to 0 while ensuring that investigators, if any came, would see only misfortune and male carelessness rather than deliberate elimination. It was military thinking applied to domestic labor, and it began with inventory. She moved through the root cellar systematically, examining supplies she'd stored over the summer and fall. Hemlock was traditional, the plant that had reportedly killed Socrates, causing ascending paralysis that could be attributed to various natural ailments if the victim wasn't examined too carefully. Death-cap mushrooms were reliable, looking enough like edible varieties that even experienced foragers sometimes made fatal errors, though the death they caused took days and involved suffering that might inspire more detailed investigation than Dinah wanted. Foxglove was subtler, especially in men who already had heart conditions, and she knew Judge Pendleton had complained of chest pains during the last gathering. Jimsonweed created confusion and hallucination that could lead men to wander into dangerous situations, though controlling the dosage was difficult. Oleander was available in the decorative bushes around the main house, every part of the plant poisonous, causing symptoms similar to heart attack if prepared correctly. Water hemlock was more potent than its cousin, causing violent seizures and death within hours. But poisons alone wouldn't suffice. She needed accidents, illnesses, mishaps that seemed unconnected to kitchen preparation. That meant thinking beyond the food to the environment, the activities, the vulnerabilities specific to each man. Judge Pendleton's bad knees made him unsteady on rough terrain. Reverend Carmichael drank heavily in the evenings, his judgment impaired by the third whiskey. Dr. Vance was arrogant about his medical knowledge, likely to dismiss early symptoms of poisoning as indigestion. Captain Fairmont rode a spirited horse that had thrown riders before. Garrett Sutton had mentioned during the last gathering that he couldn't swim, unusual for a man who'd lived his entire life in Georgia near rivers and streams. Luther Wickham was diabetic, requiring careful management of his diet, and Bradford Colfax had the kind of aggressive personality that made him take unnecessary risks to prove his courage to other men. Colonel Hartwell himself was aging, his Mexican War injuries bothering him more each year, leaving him dependent on laudanum for pain management. 8 men, 8 distinct vulnerabilities, 3 days to exploit them in ways that looked like the ordinary dangers of hunting expeditions. Dinah began her preparation on Wednesday, 2 days before the gathering would commence. She gathered mushrooms from the forest north of the quarters, mixing death caps among edible varieties, keeping them separate in her gathering basket but establishing the pattern of foraging that would explain her presence in the woods if anyone noticed. She prepared tinctures and concentrated extracts from the plants in her root cellar, storing them in small ceramic bottles that fit inside the deep pockets of her work dress. She spoke with Caleb, the blacksmith, finding reasons to visit his shop that allowed brief conversations away from Overseer's supervision. Caleb had been at Hartwell Plantation longer than Dinah, had survived by being essential enough to avoid the worst treatment while maintaining careful neutrality that kept him alive. But he'd also known Thomas, had been teaching the boy basic metalwork, and his eyes when Dinah mentioned the upcoming hunting party carried understanding that required no explicit statement. "If anyone asks," Dinah said quietly while Caleb hammered at a horseshoe, "I've been feeling poorly the last few days. Stomach troubles. You've seen me going to the root cellar for remedies." Caleb's hammer maintained its rhythm without pause. "I have noticed you looking unwell," he agreed. "Others have remarked on it too. You should rest when you can." The alibi was established, the foundation of plausible deniability if questions arose about Dinah's state of mind or her access to medicinal plants during the period when the hunting party would be experiencing their various misfortunes. She was creating a narrative of illness that would explain any unusual behavior while simultaneously providing cover for her preparation activities. Thursday evening, Dinah packed supplies for the hunting lodge. The standard provisions of flour, salt, preserved meats, coffee, sugar, plus the fresh vegetables and herbs that would allow her to prepare meals worthy of Colonel Hartwell's reputation. Among these legitimate supplies, concealed in a flour sack, were the small bottles of concentrated plant extracts, the carefully selected mushrooms, the dried leaves that looked innocuous but contained enough toxin to stop a heart if properly administered. Ruth, who worked as house servant in the main residence, found Dinah in the kitchen that evening. Ruth was younger, 23, sharp-minded and careful in the way that kept enslaved women alive when they were pretty enough to attract dangerous attention. She'd been helping Dinah with kitchen preparation for the past 2 years, and her position in the main house meant she overheard conversations that never reached the kitchen or quarters. "Colonel's been in a mood," Ruth said while helping Dinah pack dried beans. "Talking about making an example if there's any more trouble about teaching slaves to read. Says Thomas was mercy compared to what comes next." Dinah's hands continued working without pause. "What kind of example?" Ruth's voice dropped to barely audible. "The judge suggested new legislation. Public execution for any slave found with written materials. Rewards for other slaves who report it. They're planning to announce it at the hunting party, get all the important men's agreement before bringing it to county vote." The information settled into Dinah's planning like the final piece of a puzzle. These men weren't just gathering for fellowship in hunting. They were coordinating policy that would make Thomas's death official practice rather than isolated incident. They were building a system that would turn literacy into capital crime and turn enslaved people into informants against each other. They were architects of escalation, and stopping them meant stopping not just individuals but the plans they carried. "Thank you," Dinah said quietly. Ruth nodded and left without further comment. The less either of them said explicitly, the safer they'd both remain. Friday morning arrived with autumn chill and clear skies, perfect weather for hunting. The guests began arriving at mid-morning, their carriages rolling up the main drive while enslaved workers handled luggage and horses. Dinah watched from the kitchen house, memorizing faces, matching them to the vulnerabilities she'd cataloged, finalizing the plan that would unfold over the next 72 hours. Judge Marcus Pendleton was first, arriving in a well-appointed carriage, his considerable weight requiring assistance to descend the steps. His knees audibly creaked as he walked toward the main house where Colonel Hartwell waited to greet him. The judge moved slowly, cautiously, a man aware that his body had become liability but too proud to acknowledge the limitation publicly. Reverend Silas Carmichael rode up on horseback, his black coat and white collar marking his profession, his face carrying the particular smugness of men who believed their position granted them divine approval for their actions. He'd grown heavier since Dinah had last seen him, his face flushed even before the drinking would begin. Dr. Edmund Vance arrived alone, driving his own small carriage, too arrogant to require driver or assistance. He was lean, precise in his movements, carrying the medical bag that accompanied him everywhere. His eyes scanned the property with clinical assessment, noting details others missed, the kind of observation that made him dangerous. The others followed through the late morning. Captain Fairmont on his spirited horse, managing the animal with skill that suggested he'd be harder to separate from the mount that might betray him. Garrett Sutton in a carriage with his eldest son, who would apparently be joining the gathering, making the count 9 instead of 8. Luther Wickham arrived last, complaining loudly about the rough roads, his considerable bulk requiring 2 men to help him from his carriage. Bradford Colfax came with Luther, the 2 men apparently having coordinated travel. Colfax was younger than most of the others, aggressive and ambitious, the kind of man who saw the gathering as opportunity to strengthen political connections rather than simple fellowship. 9 men total now. The additional person complicated planning but didn't fundamentally change the mathematics. 9 men who'd gathered to hunt animals and plan legislation that would turn literacy into death sentence. 9 men who wouldn't leave Talbot County's forests the way they'd entered. By early afternoon, the entire party had loaded into 2 wagons for transport to the hunting lodge. Dinah rode in the supply wagon with 2 other enslaved workers, Marcus and Job, who would handle camp maintenance and horse care while Dinah managed cooking. The lodge sat 8 miles north through pine forest on a dirt track that was barely road, built 20 years earlier when Colonel Hartwell was younger and hunting had been passion rather than social obligation. The structure was solid timber construction, single large room with massive fireplace, smaller kitchen attachment, and loft sleeping area that would house the 9 guests while the 3 enslaved workers would sleep in the attached shed. It was isolated, surrounded by forest, close enough to good hunting grounds but far enough from the plantation that the men could speak and drink without concern for wives or social propriety overhearing. The lodge kitchen was smaller than what Dinah worked with at the main plantation, equipped with a cast-iron stove that Marcus had fired up before their arrival and a work table that had seen decades of meal preparation. Shelves held basic supplies left from the previous year's gathering, and a small pantry connected to the main room through a doorway covered with canvas. The setup was adequate for her purposes, isolated enough that she could work without constant observation while still being expected to produce meals that met Colonel Hartwell's standards. Dinah unpacked supplies while the 9 men settled into the main room, their voices carrying through the thin walls as they discussed the journey, commented on the weather, poured the first round of whiskey though it was barely past 3 in the afternoon. She listened to the cadence of their conversation, identifying voices, noting who dominated the discussion and who remained quieter. Judge Pendleton held court as expected, his voice carrying the authority of decades pronouncing sentence from the bench. Reverend Carmichael interjected with religious justifications whenever the conversation touched on slavery or social order. Dr. Vance spoke less frequently but with precision that made others pause to consider his observations. Colonel Hartwell played host, ensuring glasses stayed filled and conversation flowed, his voice carrying the particular confidence of a man on his own property surrounded by social equals. Captain Fairmont and Bradford Colfax engaged in competitive banter about who would bag the largest deer, their masculinity requiring constant demonstration even in leisure. Garrett Sutton and his son spoke mainly to each other, the boys seeming uncomfortable among these older men but trying to match their casual discussion of slave management and political developments. Luther Wickham complained about the accommodations, the temperature, the quality of the whiskey, establishing himself as the gathering's designated malcontent. Dinah arranged her workspace with careful deliberation. Cooking implements in their expected locations, ingredients sorted by type, the small ceramic bottles hidden inside a flour tin where casual inspection wouldn't reveal them. She'd brought extra supplies beyond what was strictly necessary, creating surplus that would allow her to prepare separate portions without the difference being noticeable. The key was maintaining the appearance of normal kitchen operation while introducing variations that would affect specific individuals in ways that seemed unconnected to the meals themselves. The first evening meal needed to be entirely safe. Establishing baseline, demonstrating that her cooking met the expected standards, ensuring that when problems arose later they wouldn't immediately be attributed to kitchen error. She prepared roasted venison from meat the Colonel had brought specifically for this purpose, along with root vegetables, fresh bread, and apple preserves. The men ate with enthusiasm, praising Dinah's skill as they always did, treating her competence as reflection of Hartwell's good judgment in kitchen management rather than acknowledgement of her expertise. She served them directly, moving through the room with the invisible efficiency expected of enslaved servants, noting details while appearing to notice nothing. Judge Pendleton ate slowly, chewing carefully on his bad teeth, drinking more whiskey than water. Reverend Carmichael consumed 3 helpings, his appetite matching his girth, already flushed from afternoon drinking. Dr. Vance ate sparingly, clinical even in his consumption, watching others with the assessment of someone cataloging weaknesses. Captain Fairmont finished quickly and pushed back from the table, restless energy making him pace the room between courses. Young Sutton picked at his food, nervous in this company, while his father ate with mechanical efficiency that suggested someone accustomed to treating meals as fuel rather than pleasure. After dinner, the men settled into drinking and conversation that would extend deep into the night. This was when they spoke most freely, when whiskey loosened tongues and the absence of wives or social oversight allowed them to discuss matters they'd moderate in town. Dinah cleaned the kitchen slowly, work that kept her within earshot while appearing entirely focused on domestic tasks that men of their station considered beneath notice. The conversation turned to politics, specifically the situation in Kansas where pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers were engaged in escalating violence. Judge Pendleton expressed confidence that Southern interests would prevail, that Northern opposition to slavery was mostly rhetorical posturing that would collapse when confronted with economic reality. Reverend Carmichael agreed, citing scripture he claimed proved slavery was divinely ordained, that attempts to eliminate it were opposition to God's design. Dr. Vance noted with clinical detachment that Northern factory workers lived in conditions often worse than Southern slaves, that abolitionists ignored wage slavery while condemning its plantation equivalent. Colonel Hartwell steered the conversation toward local matters, specifically the need for stronger enforcement of existing laws regarding slave literacy and movement. This was the legislation Ruth had mentioned, and now Dinah heard it discussed in detail. Judge Pendleton proposed expanding the legal definition of insurrection to include possession of written materials, making it capital crime rather than misdemeanor. Reverend Carmichael suggested mandatory reporting requirements, forcing slaves to inform on each other regarding literacy or escape attempts, with rewards for cooperation and severe punishment for silence. Bradford Colfax enthusiastically supported both measures, adding that they should extend patrols into areas currently under-monitored, increase random searches of slave quarters, establish harsher penalties for whites who taught slaves to read. Captain Fairmont discussed implementation from a militia perspective, noting they'd need more men and resources to enforce expanded regulations. Luther Wickham saw opportunity, suggesting that captured runaways or convicted literates could be sold further south rather than executed, turning enforcement into profit. They were planning systematically, building framework that would make Thomas's death not tragic exception but standard procedure. They were creating machinery of oppression that would operate with legal sanction and religious blessing and medical justification, each man contributing his particular expertise toward making slavery more total, more inescapable, more fatal to any attempt at dignity or learning. And they were doing it casually, between drinks, treating the destruction of human aspiration as an administrative problem requiring technical solutions. Garrett Sutton's son spoke for the first time since dinner, his voice uncertain. Do we really need to make it death penalty for reading? Seems harsh for something that doesn't directly threaten anyone. The room went quiet. Judge Pendleton fixed the young man with the look he probably used from the bench before pronouncing sentence. Reading threatens everything, he said slowly. It allows slaves to forge passes, to read abolitionist materials, to communicate across plantations, to organize. Every slave insurrection in history began with literacy. We're not being harsh, we're being preventative. Reverend Carmichael added his weight. Scripture is clear that some are meant to serve. Education disrupts natural order, makes slaves dissatisfied with their proper station. Teaching them to read is cruelty disguised as kindness, filling their heads with impossible aspirations. The boy looked at his father, who nodded agreement. Your son needs to understand these realities if he's going to manage property effectively, Garrett said to the room. Better he learns now that sentiment has no place in practical matters. Dinah finished cleaning and retreated to the shed where she'd sleep alongside Marcus and Job. The night was cold enough that their breath showed in the lamplight, and they huddled near the small stove that provided minimal warmth. Neither man asked about the conversation Dinah had overheard. Questions created liability, and they'd both survived by knowing when ignorance was armor. But Job, who was older and had been at Hartwell Plantation since before Dinah arrived, spoke quietly after several minutes of silence. They killed my nephew for having a Bible. Said he was learning to read it. Boy was 9 years old. Marcus added his own story. My sister got sold south after they found paper in her cabin. She wasn't even writing anything, just had paper. Never saw her again. The three of them sat in silence after that, each carrying their own catalog of losses, their own accounting of what these 9 men in the lodge represented. Dinah thought about Thomas, about his smile when he'd shown her the primer, about his certainty that reading was worth the risk. She thought about the legislation being planned in the next building, about how many more children would die if these men succeeded in making their proposals into law. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by cold and by planning. The next day would be Saturday, the first full day of hunting. The men would scatter into the forest in groups, pursuing deer, creating separation that would allow for accidents that seemed unconnected to each other. Dinah had worked out the sequence with the precision her mother's mother had taught her, treating it like complex recipe where timing and proportion determined outcome. Judge Pendleton would be first, his bad knees and heavy drinking making him vulnerable to fall on rough terrain, especially if his morning coffee contained enough foxglove extract to create dizziness and heart palpitations that could be attributed to exertion and age. The dose needed to be precise, enough to destabilize without being immediately obviously poisoning. timed so the effects would manifest after he'd left the lodge and was navigating uneven ground far from help. Saturday morning arrived with fog settling thick through the pine forest, reducing visibility and making the hunting more challenging but also more interesting for men who enjoyed the sport. Dinah rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, working in the kitchen while darkness still pressed against the windows. She started coffee, strong and bitter the way Dr. Vance preferred, made separately from the pot that would serve the others. She prepared eggs and bacon and biscuits, standard fare for men about to spend hours walking through cold woods. The judge's coffee received special attention. Dinah measured foxglove tincture by drops, 4 of them, enough to affect heart rhythm and create vertigo but not enough to cause immediate collapse that would seem suspicious. The digitalis compounds in foxglove were cumulative, building in the system over hours, which meant the judge could drink his coffee at breakfast and not feel the full effects until mid-morning when he'd be deep in the forest, his symptoms attributed to age and overexertion rather than anything he'd consumed. She poured his cup personally, knowing he took it black with 2 sugars, serving it the way she'd served him for 5 previous gatherings. The judge accepted it without acknowledgement, treating Dinah as mobile furniture, already engaged in conversation with Reverend Carmichael about hunting strategy. He drank deeply, complained that it wasn't hot enough though steam rose visibly from the surface, then returned his attention to breakfast and planning. The men organized into 3 groups after the meal. Judge Pendleton would hunt with Reverend Carmichael and Luther Wickham, the older men moving more slowly through terrain that suited their reduced mobility. Captain Fairmont, Bradford Colfax, and Dr. Vance formed a second group, the more active hunters who wanted to cover more ground. Colonel Hartwell and the Suttons made the third group, the host showing his guests the best locations while allowing the boy to gain experience. They departed in stages between 7 and 8 in the morning, the fog still thick enough that visibility remained limited to 30 yards. Dinah watched from the kitchen window as they disappeared into the pines, rifles over shoulders, confidence in their voices as they discussed which areas would yield the best trophies. Marcus and Job went with them to manage dogs and carry equipment, leaving Dinah alone at the lodge to clean from breakfast and begin preparation for the evening meal. The isolation was intentional on the men's part, not wanting slaves present during their actual hunting, but it served Dinah's purposes better than they understood. She had hours of unsupervised time to prepare the next phase, to clean evidence of the foxglove preparation, to ready other substances for use as opportunity presented itself. The lodge kitchen became laboratory, workspace where healing knowledge transformed into something that had nothing to do with mercy. She worked methodically, washing the judge's coffee cups separately and thoroughly, disposing of grounds where they wouldn't be found, eliminating traces that careful investigation might identify. Not that she expected investigation, not if the death looked sufficiently natural, but precision mattered. One mistake could unravel everything, could turn calculated elimination into discovered murder, could put her in the yard where Thomas had died. The morning passed slowly. Dinah prepared venison stew for the evening meal, chopping vegetables, seasoning meat, working with the automatic competence developed over 18 years of constant cooking. She baked bread, prepared side dishes, kept herself visible and occupied with exactly the work expected of her. But part of her attention remained fixed on the forest beyond the window, waiting for the sound that would indicate the first phase had succeeded. It came around 11, distant shouting filtering through the pines, male voices raised in alarm rather than triumph. Dinah continued working without pause, showing no reaction, giving no indication she'd heard anything. The voices grew closer, and after 10 minutes the Reverend and Luther came into view supporting the judge between them, the heavy man barely able to walk, his face gray and slick with sweat despite the cold. They brought him inside and laid him on one of the bunks in the loft, calling for water and blankets. Dinah brought both, still maintaining the invisible servant role, showing appropriate concern without speaking unless directly addressed. The judge's breathing was labored, his hand pressed against his chest, his eyes showing confusion about what was happening to him. His heart, Luther said, breathing hard from the effort of half-carrying the judge back to the lodge. Just collapsed out there, started clutching his chest and saying he couldn't breathe right. Reverend Carmichael knelt beside the bunk, his earlier confidence replaced with genuine worry. "We need to get Dr. Vance back here." He went north with Fairmont's group. Marcus, you know where they went? Marcus had returned with the group carrying the judge. He nodded and left immediately to find the doctor. Dinah returned to the kitchen, preparing willow bark tea that would reduce pain and potentially help with heart issues, acting exactly as competent kitchen worker would act in medical emergency, helpful without overstepping her position. Dr. Vance arrived 30 minutes later, his clinical composure intact despite the rushed return. He examined the judge with professional efficiency, checking pulse and breathing, asking questions about symptoms and timeline. The judge, still conscious but weakened, described sudden dizziness and chest pain, shortness of breath, feeling like his heart was beating irregularly. Classic presentation of cardiac event, Dr. Vance pronounced. Probably brought on by exertion in the cold. He's overweight, drinks heavily, not young anymore. I'm frankly surprised this hasn't happened before. Will he be all right? Colonel Hartwell had returned with Marcus, his gathering abandoned in response to the emergency. Dr. Vance's expression was guarded. Difficult to say. He needs rest, no more physical activity. I can give him laudanum for the pain, but there's not much else to do except wait and see if his heart stabilizes. Moving him back to the plantation in this condition could be dangerous. Best to keep him here and monitor him. The hunting party's mood had shifted from sporting enthusiasm to subdued concern. The men gathered in the main room drinking coffee instead of whiskey, speaking in lower tones, their mortality suddenly present in the room with them. Judge Pendleton's distress was a reminder that these recreational outings carried risks, that men of their age couldn't pretend they possessed the vigor of youth. Dinah served them coffee and cold lunch, sandwiches that required no cooking, maintaining her visible presence while they discussed what to do. Most wanted to continue the gathering, to hunt in the afternoon while Dr. Vance remained at the lodge monitoring the judge. One day of hunting lost wasn't reason to cancel the entire expedition, especially since the doctor said moving the judge might be dangerous anyway. They'd stay, continue as planned, just be more cautious about overexertion. The decision made, they dispersed again after lunch, leaving Dr. Vance with the judge while the others returned to the forest in reorganized groups. Colonel Hartwell took Luther with his own party since Luther was shaken enough to prefer easier terrain. Captain Fairmont, Bradford Colfax, and Reverend Carmichael formed the more active group, planning to range further in search of larger deer. Dinah found herself alone at the lodge with Dr. Vance, who remained in the main room near the bunk where Judge Pendleton rested fitfully under laudanum. The doctor sat reading a medical text he'd brought, glancing up periodically to check on his patient. His presence complicated afternoon planning, but not fatally. Dinah had anticipated that someone might remain at the lodge, and Dr. Vance was actually preferable to some others since his attention was focused on the judge rather than on kitchen activities. She worked on evening meal preparation, the venison stew that had been simmering since morning now filling the lodge with rich smell that would appeal to men returning cold and tired from the forest. She added vegetables in stages, timing them so different components would finish cooking at the optimal moment. She tasted and adjusted seasoning, performing exactly the careful cooking that had built her reputation. And she prepared the mushrooms. The death caps she'd gathered looked similar enough to edible varieties that even experienced foragers could mistake them, especially after a day of drinking and hunting. She'd keep them separate from the main stew, adding them only to specific bowls, creating variation that would seem like random distribution of ingredients rather than targeted selection. The death cap toxins were particularly insidious, destroying liver and kidneys over several days, by which time the source would be long forgotten and the symptoms attributed to illness unrelated to any specific meal. But death caps needed to wait for the right target at the right moment. Judge Pendleton was already effectively eliminated, whether he died from the foxglove or simply remained too weak to participate in the legislation he'd been planning. 1 down, 8 remaining, and the evening would provide opportunity for the second elimination if circumstances aligned correctly. Dr. Vance called from the main room around 3 in the afternoon. "Girl, bring me coffee." His tone carried the casual dismissiveness that characterized how men like him addressed enslaved women, reducing identity to function. Dinah prepared his coffee the way he preferred, black and strong, bringing it to him where he sat. The doctor accepted it without thanks, returned his attention to his book. But he spoke again after a moment, not looking up from the page. "You're Hartwell's head cook. The one who prepared the meal last night." "Yes, sir," Dinah replied, maintaining the deferential tone expected. "It was excellent." Dr. Vance closed his book, studying her with the clinical interest he probably applied to interesting medical cases. "Where did you learn to cook like that?" "Most slave cooks are adequate at best. My mother taught me before Colonel Hartwell purchased me. She worked in kitchen at the plantation where I was born." The doctor nodded, losing interest now that his curiosity was satisfied. "Well, you're competent. Make sure tonight's meal is equally good. The men will need it after this disruption." "Yes, sir." Dinah returned to the kitchen, her face showing nothing of what she felt. Dr. Vance had praised her skill while reducing her to object, acknowledging competence while denying personhood, performing the particular psychological operation that let men like him benefit from enslaved labor while maintaining belief in their own moral superiority. He'd probably written medical opinions supporting slavery as benevolent institution, arguing that slaves were mentally inferior and required white guidance, never recognizing the contradiction between that claim and his reliance on Dinah's expertise for his evening meal. The afternoon progressed toward early winter darkness, the sun setting before 5 o'clock behind the pine forest. The hunting parties began returning in stages, their voices carrying through the trees before they emerged into the clearing around the lodge. Captain Fairmont's group arrived first, the 3 men carrying 2 deer between them, pleased with their success. Colonel Hartwell's party came next, cold but satisfied, the young Sutton boy excited about his first successful shot. They gathered in the main room, warming themselves by the fire, pouring whiskey that would continue until dinner and beyond. The judge remained in his bunk, conscious but weak, Dr. Vance reporting that his condition was stable but concerning. The mood was subdued compared to the previous evening, the injury reminding them they weren't as invincible as their social positions suggested. Dinner was served at 6, the venison stew ladled into bowls, bread passed around the table, men eating with the appetite that came from hours of physical activity in cold weather. Dinah had prepared 9 bowls, each seemingly identical, the variations invisible to casual observation. Most contained only safe ingredients, the stew exactly what it appeared to be. But 2 bowls, designated for specific men through careful tracking of where each person sat, contained the mushrooms that would initiate slow destruction of liver and kidneys. The targets were Luther Wickham and Bradford Colfax, chosen for tactical reasons. Luther was the diabetic whose medical condition would complicate diagnosis, making poison harder to identify among his existing health problems. Bradford was young and healthy, which meant symptoms would take longer to manifest and would seem even less connected to anything consumed at the lodge. Both men were zealous supporters of the proposed legislation. Both had spoken enthusiastically about making literacy a capital crime. Dinah served them personally, placing the designated bowls in front of each man, maintaining the invisible servant efficiency. Neither man paid attention to which bowl they received, treating the service as background process rather than action worthy of notice. They ate with enthusiasm, Bradford finishing his portion and requesting seconds, which Dinah provided from the safe pot that contained no mushrooms. The poison dose was in the first bowl, carefully calculated, requiring no reinforcement. The evening progressed like the night before, drinking and conversation, plans for tomorrow's final day of hunting. They discussed the judge's condition, agreeing that Dr. Vance and someone else should probably stay with him while the others hunted, that they couldn't simply abandon him though his collapse had dampened the gathering's spirit. Reverend Carmichael suggested prayer, leading the group in blessing that thanked God for their prosperity and asked for the judge's recovery, somehow managing to invoke divine favor while sitting in lodge built on wealth extracted from enslaved labor. Dinah cleaned the kitchen while they talked, washing bowls with careful attention to which had contained mushrooms and which hadn't, keeping them separate during cleaning then mixing them afterwards so no pattern would be visible to investigation. She disposed of the remaining mushrooms, burying them in the forest while ostensibly emptying kitchen waste, eliminating evidence that she'd prepared anything beyond standard ingredients. The men eventually retired, the hour late and tomorrow requiring early rising for those who'd hunt. Dr. Vance remained in the main room on a cot position where he could monitor the judge, his medical dedication genuine even if his politics were reprehensible. The others climbed to the loft, their voices gradually quieting as exhaustion and whiskey pulled them toward sleep. Dinah retreated to the shed where Marcus and Job were already sleeping, both men too tired from the day's work to do more than acknowledge her arrival. She lay in the darkness thinking about the mushrooms working their way through Luther's and Bradford's systems, the toxins binding to proteins, beginning the process that would destroy organ function over the next several days. They'd feel fine tomorrow, maybe slightly nauseous but nothing alarming. The real symptoms wouldn't manifest until Tuesday or Wednesday, long after the hunting party had concluded and everyone had returned to their separate homes. By the time they understood they were dying, the cause would be impossible to trace. Death cap poisoning presented like severe gastroenteritis, and treatment was largely ineffective once symptoms appeared. Dr. Vance would probably be consulted given his connection to both men, but he'd attribute their illness to bad food or contaminated water consumed somewhere other than the hunting lodge. The mushrooms would never be suspected because the timeline wouldn't connect consumption to symptoms in any obvious way. 2 more eliminated, bringing the count from 9 to 6 remaining if the judge's heart didn't recover. Sunday would be the final day of hunting, the last opportunity to reduce the number further before they all dispersed back to their separate residences. Dinah needed to be bold but not reckless, aggressive but not obvious, eliminate as many as possible while maintaining plausible deniability about each death. She thought about Thomas, about his certainty that reading was worth any risk. She thought about the legislation these men were planning, about how many more children would die if their proposals became law. She thought about her mother's teaching, about how knowledge could heal or harm depending on application and intention. The night was cold enough that breath condensed into visible clouds inside the shed. Dinah pulled the thin blanket tighter and waited for dawn, for the final day of hunting, for the last chances to ensure these men wouldn't leave the forest to implement their plans. 6 men remaining, 1 day left, and she had barely begun. Sunday morning broke with ice coating the pine needles and a sky the color of dulled steel. Dinah woke before the others in the shed, her body accustomed to rising in darkness after 18 years of preparing meals that needed to be ready when white folks wanted them. She moved quietly past Marcus and Job and made her way to the lodge kitchen where the stove had gone cold overnight. Building the fire was meditative work, arranging kindling and larger wood in patterns that would catch and sustain heat efficiently. The flames took hold gradually, spreading warmth that pushed back against the November chill. Dinah filled the coffee pot with water from the barrel outside, the surface frozen enough that she had to break through a thin layer of ice. Judge Pendleton's labored breathing was audible from the main room where Dr. Vance had spent the night monitoring his patient. The doctor emerged into the kitchen area looking rumpled and tired, his usual clinical composure somewhat diminished by interrupted sleep and the reality that his medical knowledge couldn't do much for a man whose heart was failing. The other men began stirring in the loft, voices and footsteps overhead signaling the start of their final day of hunting. They descended in stages, drawn by the smell of coffee and cooking bacon, gathering around the table with less enthusiasm than previous mornings. The judge's visible decline had cast shadow over the gathering, reminder that their positions of power couldn't protect them from mortality. Colonel Hartwell addressed the group after everyone had received coffee. "I think most of us should hunt today as planned. No point in everyone sitting around here when there's nothing to be done except wait." He nodded toward Dr. Vance. "Edmund, you'll stay with him obviously. And perhaps one other person to assist if needed." Reverend Carmichael volunteered, his appetite for hunting apparently satisfied by yesterday's outing. The others would hunt in 2 groups, Colonel Hartwell with the Suttons and Captain Fairmont with Luther Wickham and Bradford Colfax. Luther complained about stomach discomfort, attributing it to too much rich food and whiskey, unaware that the nausea he felt was early sign of the mushroom toxins beginning their work. The hunting parties departed around 8, leaving Dr. Vance and Reverend Carmichael at the lodge with the ailing judge. Dinah cleaned breakfast dishes while the 2 men conversed in low tones. The Reverend eventually wandered outside to walk the perimeter of the clearing, his restlessness making confinement difficult. This left Dinah with opportunities she hadn't anticipated, time alone in the kitchen with ingredients and privacy. She'd brought oleander from the decorative bushes around the main plantation house, every part of the plant poisonous but the leaves particularly potent when dried and ground into powder. The symptoms of oleander poisoning resembled heart attack, which made it perfect for a situation where one man was already experiencing cardiac crisis and medical attention was focused on that rather than looking for additional causes. Reverend Carmichael would take tea in the afternoon, his habit so consistent that Dinah had served him during every previous gathering. He preferred it sweet with honey, the sugar masking any bitterness from what she planned to add. She wanted him symptomatic before the hunting parties returned, creating another emergency that would compound the chaos and prevent anyone from thinking clearly about patterns. The Reverend returned from his walk around 10, complaining about the cold and requesting hot tea. Dinah prepared it exactly as he preferred, measuring dried oleander powder into the cup before adding honey and hot water, stirring until the powder dissolved completely. The amount was generous, more than strictly necessary, but she wanted certainty rather than a dose that might only make him sick. She served him in the main room where he'd settled into a chair near the fire. The Reverend accepted the tea with barely a glance, already engaged in conversation with Dr. Vance about whether the judge's collapse represented divine judgment. Carmichael drank his tea steadily while talking, consuming the entire cup within 15 minutes. It was closer to 45 minutes when the Reverend's voice changed, becoming strained mid-sentence. Dr. Vance noticed immediately. Carmichael stood abruptly, hand going to his chest, his face showing confusion and alarm. "Something's wrong," the Reverend said, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. "My chest feels tight." Dr. Vance was on his feet instantly, guiding Carmichael to another bunk, began the same examination process he'd used on Judge Pendleton. "This is impossible," Vance muttered. 2 cardiac events in 2 days among men with no family history of heart disease. But it was happening regardless of whether it made sense, the oleander toxins disrupting heart rhythm and causing cardiac distress that looked identical to natural heart attack. Dr. Vance administered laudanum and tried to make his patient comfortable, but his expression showed growing concern that went beyond worry for individual patients. The hunting parties returned earlier than expected, summoned back by Marcus who'd been sent to find them after Carmichael's collapse. They arrived cold and alarmed, the sport of hunting forgotten in the face of multiple medical emergencies. Colonel Hartwell took charge immediately, organizing the men to prepare for departure back to the plantation. But Dr. Vance argued against moving either patient. Both men were in critical condition, and the rough 8-mile wagon ride could prove fatal. Better to keep them stable here and send for additional medical help from town. Captain Fairmont volunteered to make the ride, his horsemanship making him the logical choice. He departed within the hour, pushing his mount hard toward town while the others settled into anxious waiting. The afternoon stretched with tension. Luther Wickham's stomach discomfort had worsened, though he attributed it to stress rather than illness. Bradford Colfax appeared unaffected, his youth protecting him from immediate manifestation of symptoms that would hit him in another day or 2. Evening came early with winter darkness, and still no sign of Captain Fairmont returning. The men began expressing concern about his delay. It was nearly 8 o'clock when they heard a horse approaching. But it wasn't Fairmont who dismounted. It was a young man from town, breathless and shaken. "Captain Fairmont's dead," the messenger gasped. "Horse threw him about 3 miles from here. Broke his neck in the fall. Found him an hour ago when his mount came into town without a rider." The hunting party that had started with 9 men was now down to 6, with 2 more clinging to life. Dr. Vance's face showed something beyond medical concern, moving into territory of suspicion. 3 men experiencing life-threatening events in less than 48 hours. This goes beyond coincidence. Something is wrong here. Colonel Hartwell tried to dismiss the concern. Fairmont's death was accident, tragic but unrelated to the heart problems. But the doctor wasn't convinced. "We need to consider environmental factors. Something in the water, the food, something we're all being exposed to." The suggestion sent immediate tension through the group. Garrett Sutton pulled his son closer, protective instinct triggered by the implication that they might all be at risk. Colonel Hartwell made a decision. "We're leaving at first light tomorrow. All of us." The men were too agitated to sleep. They sat in the main room drinking coffee instead of whiskey, trying to make sense of the cascade of disasters. Nobody suggested poison because the idea was literally unthinkable. Enslaved people didn't murder their owners. Even considering that Dinah might have agency to harm them would require acknowledging she was fully human with capacity for planning and rage, and their entire worldview depended on denying that possibility. Judge Pendleton died at 2 a.m, his breathing simply stopping. Dr. Vance confirmed death and covered the body with a blanket. Reverend Carmichael followed 3 hours later just as dawn was breaking, his heart surrendering to the oleander toxins. 6 men remained of the original 9. They loaded the bodies onto the supply wagon with grim efficiency, wrapped in blankets. The living patients, Luther and Bradford, were helped into the second wagon. The journey back to Hartwell Plantation began in cold silence, 3 dead, 2 sick, 1 killed by horse, all within 3 days. Dinah sat in the supply wagon next to the wrapped bodies of Judge Pendleton and Reverend Carmichael, 2 men who'd planned legislation that would make literacy capital crime, who'd celebrated Thomas's death as necessary lesson. The Hartwell plantation came into view around mid-morning. Colonel Hartwell began giving orders for handling the bodies and caring for the sick men. Dinah was dismissed to return to her regular kitchen duties. She walked toward the kitchen house without looking back, her posture showing exhaustion expected after days of constant work. No one questioned her about the deaths or illnesses. She was invisible again, returned to her proper place, useful for her skills but unremarkable in her person. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.